So this morning we are beginning our fall series, as I had mentioned earlier. Don't forget these little sheets are out there in the foyer. Grab one. I really encourage you to use it as an opportunity to read these passages before Sunday, because many of these stories we aren't going to know, or you might not be familiar with, or you know the kids version and you missed the adult version. Today we're going to kind of talk about that a little bit with Noah. And so we are going to be in the middle of, we're going to be in the Old Testament till the middle of December. And for most of these Sundays, we're going to be dealing with historical books and historical stories. Part of what I want you, I'm going to do, spend a little bit of time kind of just on introduction, because I want you to hear some of these things, because it's important, not just for the series, but it's really important for today's passage. But part of what we see is that in the Bible, we can go through our Bibles, and our Bibles, we look at them and say, well, this is this book, this is this book. But these books have all been written really with different genres. And so there are some kind of genres that you can go through. What we're going to be spending most of our time in this series with is with historical books. And so historical books tell a story. They use narrative. But there are other books. Psalms is kind of its own category. Psalms and Proverbs. There's wisdom literature. There are prophets, there are gospels, there are epistles, there's apocalyptic literature. All of these things are writing in a different way. We don't read a poem the same way that we might read a historical book. We read these in different ways. And so it helps us to understand that kind of going in and looking at these passages, that we're going to read them in a little bit of a different way. Another thing that we understand about that is, and that kind of, I want y'all to know kind of going into this, is that these stories are telling stories. These are stories that shape our lives. They begin to help us understand who we are. They help us understand who God is. They invite us into the story. It's not just a story that we hear. It's a story that we are invited. It's our story. It's who we are as the people of God. This is God's story. We are God's people. It's our story. Why is this important? Well, the big reason is that stories are messy. I mean, think about the story of your life. Your story is messy. Stories are messy because life is messy. But we're conditioned so many times to think that faith or belief should be kind of just put out in bullet points, and it should all work if we just kind of make some bullet points. We're created this way. I love bullet points. I really enjoy them. I like spreadsheets. Those are fun things to me. But that's not the way that faith is always played out. You can go, if you want to Nazarene.org and click on the little thing that says beliefs, and you can go and they will give you bullet points. This is what we believe. You can do that for most any church's website. They'll tell you this is what we believe, and they're in neat bullet points. There might be 2, there might be 5, there might be 12, there might be 40, but they have these bullet points that say this is what we believe. I think those lists are important. I think one of the most important lists we have, and I think y'all know this about me, are the creeds. I think it's important that we can say, what do you believe? Well, I believe in God, the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, and in Jesus Christ, his only Son, our Lord, who was conceived by the Holy Spirit, born of the Virgin Mary, suffered under Pontius Pilate. We should know our faith and understand those things. But the reason this is important is when we get into these stories, it doesn't all fit neatly in bullet points. Today's story is, guys, it's rough. It's not good. It's really, really, really rough. And it doesn't fit neatly in a story. It doesn't fit neatly in our understanding of even the story that most of us will say, Pastor, I thought you said you were preaching on Noah. And I don't know if you know this, but I had the pop-up book of Noah when I was a kid, and it's not that messy. At the very end, you could pull a tab, and Noah opened his hands, and a dove came out. Like, it was a great book. But when we look at the story, we realize there's so much more going on in this story than what we tell our children or the way we teach our children about this story. Let me give you just kind of an example. There was an expert of bullet points, and he came to Jesus in Luke chapter 10. Y'all know this story. He comes to Jesus in Luke chapter 10, and he says, tell me Of all these bullet points, I have hundreds of them. Of all these bullet points, you tell me what's the one that I need to live out the most in order to inherit eternal life. Do y'all remember that story? And Jesus says to him, I'll tell you, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. And you've got to imagine the man was like, well, that's not as clean as I wanted it. So just wrap it up in one point. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. So the man says, so who is my neighbor? And what does Jesus do? Jesus says, well, here's the 10 bullet points, and this is how you discern who your neighbor is. No. Jesus says, well, there was a man traveling down to Jericho. And Jesus tells what? A story. When people say, Jesus, tell us about God, tell us about the Father, what does Jesus say? Here's 10 bullet points, and if you have these, you're good. No, Jesus says there was a man who had 2 sons. He tells stories. And so I want you to hear that because it's so important when we look at this passage that we understand we are invited into a story. Stories are messy, stories are ugly, stories leave us with questions. And today you might leave with some questions, and I think that's okay. I think that's the way a lot of these stories play out in our Bibles. So this series that we're doing, I've named Guided by God's Promises. And one of the questions that I'm going to kind of be asking as we go through this series is asking the question, what is God's promise in this text? So by the time we're done today, hopefully you will see and say, okay, that's what God's promise is in this text. We see it laid out pretty clearly in chapter 9. So that's where we're going to go. We're going to kind of be asking that question as we go through the series. We're going to be asking questions of what do we learn about God in this text, but then also what do we learn about ourselves in this text? So let's start off with the Noah story. We'll go to Genesis chapter 6. We'll look at verses 5 and 8. When the Lord saw that human wickedness was widespread on the earth and that every inclination of the human mind was nothing but evil all the time, the Lord regretted that he had made man on earth, and he was deeply grieved. Then the Lord said, I will wipe mankind whom I created off the face of the earth, together with the animals. Which my question here is, what did the animals do? But anyway, together with the animals, creatures that crawl, birds of the sky, for I regret that I made them. In verse 8, Noah, however, found favor with the Lord. So this story, we start off at a really dark place. This is the part of the story that we kind of already start skipping this part of the story and say, when are we going to do animals 2 by 2? But we start off this story and God says, he looks at human wickedness and he says, I regret that I ever created you. Well, how am I going to respond? Going to wipe it all over. Just wipe the slate clean. We're just going to start over. Now, this is the hard part of the story. But in this story, we kind of miss some of the things that are happening. So let's walk through just a couple different places. So verse 6 says, the Lord regretted that he had made man on the earth, and he was deeply grieved. Now, this picture of God, it probably doesn't fit in your bullet point God. This God is a God that regrets. It's a God who grieves. And it's a God who many times kind of makes us uncomfortable. What do we do with a God who regrets? What do we do with a God who is deeply grieved? The next verse doesn't really help us at all. Verse 7, the Lord says, I will wipe mankind, whom I created, off the face of the earth. So God decides to take action. He's going to wipe mankind off the face of the earth. And then verse 8 happens. Noah, however, found favor. Now, this word here in Hebrew, I'm not a Hebrew scholar, but the word here for favor in Hebrew is the word hain. And hain is also translated grace. It's where we get the name, or there's another Hebrew term, Hanan, which is where we get the name Hannah, which is gracious one, grace. So Noah, however, found grace in the Lord. So here are our options. Kind of options. Option one, God's starting over from scratch, wiping everybody off, just gonna wipe them off. Or option two, to save Noah and his family and some of the animals. So what does God decide to do? Y'all know the story. He decides to save Noah and his family and some of the animals. Now, this is an important kind of point that I want y'all to see. God doesn't just save Noah. God uses Noah as an agent for the renewal of creation. God doesn't just save Noah. God could have just said, I'm going to wipe the whole slate clean. You're all gone. We're just going to start over. Maybe I'll do better next time. But God finds grace when he looks at Noah and says, I'm not just going to save you, I'm going to use you. You're going to be a part of this story. And so God doesn't just save Noah, God uses Noah as a part of this story, as an agent for the renewal of creation. That he has to build this boat, that he has to corral the animals, that he has to keep the animals, that he cares for the animals, that he feeds the animals, that he releases the animals. Noah's got a big job. And God brings Noah into the story, and God brings Noah into the renewal. It says, we're going to reset. But I'm not going to reset alone. I'm going to reset with you. And so he brings Noah into this story. Now, we can kind of run through the story. Y'all, this is the part of the story y'all know. Noah builds an ark. Okay, it's not the one in Kentucky, but he builds an ark. That was a joke. He builds an ark. And what happens? Gets the animals in, gets his family in, it starts raining, and it keeps raining, and it keeps raining, and it keeps raining, and finally the rain stops, and the water begins to recede. Noah sends out, y'all know this story, Noah sends out a dove, the dove comes back, Noah waits a week, sends out another dove, the dove comes back with an olive branch, he sends out another dove, and the dove never comes back, with the assumption that the dove has found somewhere to nest and that it's safe to come out. Y'all remember that story? I've got the pop-up book, if anybody missed it. I'm not joking. My grandfather gave it to me. It was a great book. And the rainbow opened up when it was really cool. So we know that story. I don't think I need to go through the story in those little details any farther. So I want to pick up the story at the end of the story after we've gotten Noah is back. They've come out of the boat. And so we move into Genesis chapter 8, verse 15. Then God spoke to Noah. Verse 16, come out of the ark, you, your wife, your sons' wives with you. Bring out all the living creatures that are with you, birds, livestock, those that crawl on the earth, and they will spread over the earth and be fruitful and multiply on the earth. They're a part of what? The renewal. They're a part of bringing back creation. So Noah, along with his sons, his wife, and his sons' wives came out. All the animals, all the creatures that crawl, all the flying creatures, everything that moves on the earth came out of the ark by their families. And so they come out and they build an altar and they sacrifice an animal, which I'm sure the animal's like, I made it through this whole journey and now I get sacrificed. Just point it out, just one of those pieces of the story. So they have a sacrifice. Then we move into chapter 9. So chapter 9, verse 1 says, God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. How many times has God said that to him now? Twice. Okay, notice. When we look at these stories, y'all have heard me say this before, when we look at these stories, when things are repeated, the author's saying, pay attention. All right? That wasn't a very good snap. Pay attention. So, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. Verse 2, the fear and terror of you will be in every living creature on the earth, every bird of the sky, every creature that crawls on the ground, and all the flesh of the sea. They are placed under your authority. Every creature that lives and moves will be food for you. As I gave the green plants, I have given you everything. I've given you everything. However, you must not eat meat with its lifeblood in it. And I will require a penalty for your lifeblood. I will require it from the animal and from the human. If someone murders a fellow human, I will require that person's life. Whoever sheds human blood, by humans his blood will be shed, for God made humans in his image. It's an important point. But you, be fruitful and multiply. Spread over the earth and multiply on it. How many times are we at there now? 3 times. So we have this story here, and God is in the process of renewing creation. And so he tells them, these are the things we're going to do. This is the part of the story that's going to make you a little uncomfortable, what I'm about to say, all right? This is a good point to listen. The struggle with this story is that God brought the flood. Why? What did we learn back in chapter 6? Because man was evil. And God wipes out creation with the exception of Noah and his family and the animals on the ark. But here's the part where I get uncomfortable, okay? I'm not saying like I've got this all figured out. I don't. I get uncomfortable. When creation is reset up, that after creation is reset up, how far in this story do we have to get before evil is back into the story? Not far. Not far at all. And so in this story, we don't see humankind, we don't see man changed by this story. But we see God changed in the story. God regretted creating humankind, and then God sets this up and says that we're going to do some things differently. And then this is what God does. Okay, this is verse 8. If that made you uncomfortable, hang with me, okay, because I hope I can prove it. All right, so verse 8. Then God said to Noah and his sons with him, understand that I am establishing my covenant with you and your descendants after you. Who's Noah's descendants? We are. If you're not in that first 5 or whatever, we're all descendants. So I'm establishing this covenant with you and your descendants after you, and with every living creature that is with you, birds, livestock, and all the wildlife on the earth that are with you, all the animals of the earth that came out of the ark. I establish my covenant with you that never again will every creature be wiped out by floodwaters. There will never again be a flood to destroy the earth. And God said, this is the sign of the covenant I am making between me and you and every living creature with you, a covenant for all future generations. I have placed my bow in the clouds, and it will be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. Whenever I form clouds over the earth, a bow, and the bow appears in the clouds, I will remember the covenant. That stood out to me this week because in my pop-up book, I remember it saying, every time you see a rainbow, that's a reminder to us of God's covenant. That's not what God says here. God says every time he sees it, he'll be reminded of the covenant. Yeah, that's a little more exciting. God's the one that remembers us. God is the one who made the covenant. Where was I? Verse 15, I will remember my covenant between me and you and all the living creatures. Water will never again become a flood to destroy every creature. The bow will be in the clouds, and I will look at it and remember the permanent covenant between God and the living creatures on earth. God said to Noah, this is the sign of the covenant that will be established between me and every living creature on the earth. Y'all probably weren't counting in that section. The word covenant, how many times do you think it was used? I don't know if you noticed, it was a lot. 8 times, if I counted correctly, if I didn't miss one. 8 times. In these verses, we see God commit himself to find a new way to heal creation. God has tried to heal creation, and it doesn't take very long to realize that we are just as evil as we were before the flood. And God commits himself to relationship and commits himself to finding a new way to bring about redemption. A new way to bring about salvation. A new way to bring about the end of evil. And in these verses, we can read through them and we can flip over here to chapter 6, and it's pretty rough. Chapter 6, we can go through it and we see God regrets. God said that he's deeply grieved. I will wipe mankind off the face of the earth. I regret that I made them. We read all of this and we flip the page over, and in the page, God is saying, I am establishing my covenant with you. I'm establishing my covenant with you that will never again will every creature be wiped out. This is the sign of the covenant I am making between me and you and every living creature, a covenant for all future generations. I've placed my bow in the clouds, and it will be a sign of the covenant between me and you and earth. I will remember my covenant between me and you and all the living creatures. The bow will be in the clouds, and I will look at it, and I will remember the permanent. We added an adjective, the permanent covenant between God and the living creatures on earth. And God said to Noah, this is the sign of the covenant I have established. We go from a God who deeply regrets, or who regrets and is deeply grieved, to a God who says, I am committing myself to you. In all the sinfulness and all the wickedness, I am committing myself to you. You see, we see a picture here of a God who responds to evil out of violence, a God who responds in an incredible amount of violence that we don't even really want to think through, to a God who gets to the end of the story and says, I am committing myself to you. I don't want you to forget. This isn't a temporary covenant. This isn't a covenant that only exists if you behave. This is a covenant. They didn't have an opportunity at this point yet to even do anything wrong. And God's saying, I am with you. I am committing myself to you. The God who is disappointed, the God who is grieved, is committing himself to you, to me. So I started this and I said to you, one of the questions I'm going to ask is not just what do we learn about God, but what do we learn about ourselves? Because God reminds us twice in this story, you were created in my image. What do we learn about ourselves? And I think it comes down to this. How many times have you been disappointed or grieved? How many times have you lost something and you don't know how to get it back? How many times has somebody let you down who you thought could never let you down, that you loved? How many times has something turned out in a way that you don't know how to handle it? And I think we can see ourselves in the God of chapter 6 that says, well, the best way to reply, the best way to deal with this is in grief. And when we respond in grief, sometimes when that grief isn't handled correctly, that grief ends up to violence. And then we flip the page over and we see a God who says, I am establishing a covenant. I am committing myself to relationship. I'm committing myself to you. You see, when I look at chapter 6, verse 6, what I see in myself is I see myself withdrawing from relationship. I see myself leaving that relationship. I see myself cutting people off because they've hurt me and because I don't want to be hurt again. I see myself walking away from relationship. Am I the only one? In chapter 9, we see a God who says, I've committed myself in a new way to relationship. I'm committing myself to you. I'm committing myself in an incredible way to you. This is not a temporary commitment. This is a permanent commitment. This is an eternal commitment. And so often in my life, it's so much easier to see God in chapter 6 and to say, that's me. It's easier to walk away. It's easier to shut him out. It's easier not to talk to him. It's easier to separate. But when we respond in anger, we don't restore relationship. And I think the beauty of this story for us this morning is a reminder that when we commit ourselves to relationship, we commit ourselves to one another. We commit ourselves in a way that God has committed himself to us. I know last week I mentioned one of my favorite preachers, Barbara Brown Taylor, and this week as I was working on this, I kept coming back to a sermon she preached a really long time ago. The name of the sermon was called God's Daring Plan. And I've probably told you about the sermon before, but I'm not going to preach her whole sermon, just don't worry about that. But in her sermon, this is the gist, this is the 2-minute version of her sermon. In the sermon, she sets up this whole story where God is trying to figure out, what am I going to do? What am I going to do with these people? They're evil, they're bad. What am I going to do? And she has this just incredible, and it's just a beautiful sermon where God's having this debate and he has all the angels together and they're having this conversation. What am I going to do? And at the very end of the sermon, she writes, and God's Son says, I know what I'm going to do. And he gets up from the table and steps away. And then she writes, all of heaven got quiet till there was one sound, the sound of an infant crying. You see, I love that story because it tells us so much about who God is. A God of Genesis 6 that says, I'm done with y'all. To the God of Genesis 9 that says, no. I'm going to commit myself to you in a whole new way. And that story plays all the way through all of these stories, and that story is going to end up this year on Christmas morning on a Sunday when a baby cries. And to remind us that the God who said, I'm done with them, this is the same God that sent a son to say, you actually have no idea how far I'm going to go for you. You have no idea what I really am going to do for you. And for me this morning, this week, as I've just really wrestled with this story, I keep coming back to what does it look like in my life to say, I'm going to commit myself to those broken relationships. I'm going to commit myself to those things, to those people that have hurt, to those people that I need to commit myself and to say, I'm not going to let violence, I'm not going to let grief win. I'm going to let grace win. I'm going to let love win. I'm going to let commitment win. Because the story I see of our God in this story is a God who says, I'm going to win. And it doesn't happen through violence. It doesn't happen through these things. It happens through commitment. I know I've told you all this, but years ago, it's been a long time, that I dealt with this, and some of y'all could probably figure out exactly what I'm talking about. But I went through some times where I really struggled with people that I felt had really hurt me. And when you run into them in Walmart, what do? And I was talking to Scott Peterson, my former pastor, about it, and I was really struggling because I probably had run into somebody in Walmart, or this is probably before we had Publix. And I said to Scott, I just don't know what to do. I don't know how to handle it. I don't know what to say to them other than just like run away and leave my basket in the middle of the aisle and just go to my car. That actually works really well, but it doesn't help the relationship. And this is what Scott said to me. He said, John, sometimes you just have to walk up to somebody and to say, I know that we haven't always seen eye to eye. I know that we haven't always agreed. But I want you to know that I'm committing myself to loving you. And he said, walk away. That's it. And I think when I read the story, that's what I keep coming back to, is sometimes we just have to say, I'm committing myself to relationship. I'm committing myself to loving you. Because that's the story I see of a God in our Bibles that say, this is what I'm committing myself to. This morning as we close, that's kind of my question. I know for some of you, there are hurts in your lives that are unbelievably deep. There are hurts when I go through that list and say, for some of you, you've lost something that you don't know how to get back, or something has turned out in a way that you don't know how to handle, and some of you are like, woohoo, that's me. I get it, because that's me too. The easy route is to say, I'm done. But I don't think that's the story of God. The story of God is a little bit more daring than that, who says, I'm committing myself to this relationship. I'm committing myself to renewing relationship. And this morning, there's some of us that might just need to come and find a place to say, I don't know how to commit myself to that relationship because I'm struggling so much. Pastor, even you bringing it up makes me uncomfortable, and I just want to shut you down now because I don't want to do that. I get it. But the story of our God is a story of a God who says, I'm committing. That doesn't mean it's going to be easy. It doesn't mean that everything is just fixed. It doesn't mean a trip to the altar, everything's hunky-dory. People still say hunky-dory. That doesn't fix everything. But I believe in a God who does heal, a God who restores, a God who brings life in the brokenness, in the hurt. And for some of you this morning, you might just need to come and find a place and just say, God, I need you, because I can't do it, obviously. I need you to bring restoration. I need you to bring life into these broken places. As we sing, most of you know the routine. Pastor James will be right over here if anyone would like to pray with him. Whether you just need a pastor to pray with you, whether you want to talk to him about salvation, whatever it is, Pastor James would love to be able to pray and talk to you there. I'll be down at this altar if anyone wants to come to be anointed for healing, whether it is physical, emotional, spiritual, whether it's a relationship that you don't see that there's any way for it to be mended, for it to be restored. Maybe that's the healing we need. And the other altars, if you just need to find a place to come and to say, God, I need you to show me the path forward in this relationship, in these hurts. God, I need you to do it. I just invite you to come as we sing. Let us stand.